Good morning. My name is Tom Wardle, and I'm a Dharma teacher with Empty Moon Zen. Before I begin my prepared remarks today, I'd like to say a few words about the events of the week and the death of Chadwick Boseman. I found out that Chadwick Boseman died last night, shortly before I went to bed, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I have wept several times since. He was best known for portraying T'Challa, the Black Panther, in the movie of the same name. Uh, but he was much more than just that, just the role that he played. He was a truly inspiring man who, though ill with terminal cancer for 4 years, continued to work and kept the news largely to himself and his family and those others who needed to know. His death was totally unexpected, and as devastating as it is to those of us who are fans of his work uh, and fans of comic books, it is all the more so to those of uh, the larger community that he touched. And first of all, about comic books, it's very easy to have a negative attitude about comics, uh, to trivialize them, but they are a legitimate form of literature, and they have reached millions of people over the years. I grew up reading comic books, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I still read comics. Comics are a legitimate form of literature. When I was a teacher, I would occasionally get concerned questions from parents who would say, you know, I can't get my kid to read anything real. They just keep reading comic books. And I would always say, well, what's the problem? They're reading. And that love of reading, that connection through stories that you find meaningful or exciting or moving, only grows. Comics, like all literature, have the power to communicate, to connect, and to inspire. They tell stories, and the stories that we tell matter. Now, Chadwick Boseman wasn't just known for the Black Panther, although that's the role that made him famous. Before that, he had played Jackie Robinson, James Brown, and a great hero of mine, Thurgood Marshall, all in the course of a single decade, telling these critical stories, these undertold stories for all of us, and particularly for the African American community. The fact is that we live in stories. Stories are how we make sense of the world, how we make meaning out of our lives. And when we tell stories, they create our world, a theme that I'll return to in a moment. Critically, stories that depict people of color as other, as degenerate, as violent, as dangerous, cost lives. Lives like Jacob Blake's, who, though he lives, will be affected forever by the events earlier this week. Lives like George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, Tatiana Jefferson's, Ora Rosser's, Stephen Clark's, Botam Jean's, Philando Castile's, Alton Sterling's, Michelle Cusseau's, Freddie Gray's, Janisha Fonville's, Eric Garner's, Akai Gurley's, Gabriela Navarez, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, and far too many others. So before I begin my formal talk, I'll simply say again that stories matter. Thank you. So, what I want to talk about today is delusion. We talk a lot about delusion in Zen and Buddhism. In fact, along with greed and hatred, delusion is one of the three poisons, and it's often understood as the most pernicious of the three. The logic goes that greed is relatively easily cured through generosity, and hatred through kindness. And the remedies are very much in the fake it till you make it category. That is, you don't actually have to feel generous to do something generous, nor do you have to feel kind to be kind. Often the feeling comes some time after the action, if it comes at all. I also like to think that those cures go both ways, that showing a greedy person generosity can break through their greed, and that kindness can heal hatred. Sometimes, at least. But what can we do about delusion? That one seems much trickier. The traditional answer would be that insight alleviates delusion, but I don't find that particularly illuminating. In fact, I wonder what is delusion exactly, other than the opinions of those who don't share my politics, of course. Buddhism teaches that delusion is ignorance. But ignorance of what? The canonical answer would be that ignorance is unawareness of the unsatisfactory nature of existence, the first noble truth. Actually, the sutras define ignorance as unawareness of all four of the noble truths, karma, and the three treasures of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But I find it most helpful to focus on that first truth. Now let's get something out of the way right now. The first noble truth is often presented as life is suffering, which is not only melodramatic and depressing, it's also misleading. The Sanskrit term is dukkha, which more closely means unsatisfactoriness. The word's etymology is believed to refer to a wagon wheel with an axle hole that's slightly off-center, something that would make for a most unsatisfactory experience for any passengers, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, you might understandably push back a little against the idea that life is inherently unsatisfactory in nature, pointing out quite correctly that sometimes it can be thoroughly satisfying. And the Buddha would agree with you. But he would also point out that those moments of satisfaction don't last. Any good feeling we might experience arises from a specific constellation of causes and conditions, and is therefore inevitably fragile because it depends on those conditions. When those conditions change, our feelings of satisfaction, happiness, comfort, and security change too. And when they do, you're very likely to find yourself chasing the dragon, trying to get them back. Ultimately, much of the hardship and difficulty we experience in life comes down to this failure to accept the reality of how things are. We reject unpleasant parts of our experience, and in doing so, we actually reject reality itself. But that begs the question, what is real anyway? One reasonable answer is anything you can perceive with your senses. This is reality. That is reality. How do I know? Because I can see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, touch it. Unfortunately, this understanding erodes rapidly, and we don't even have to turn to ancient esoteric ideas to challenge it. Modern science has it well in hand. At least in the West, that five-sense model actually originated with Aristotle in the 4th century before the current era. Since then, biologists have effectively demonstrated that humans actually have somewhere around 16 or so different senses, based on counting the different types of sensory receptors in our bodies. Physicists will actually go one better on the subject of reality and get us out of our own limited experience. Various theories have been put forth, but it's fairly clear that there are whole realms beyond human perception, things that are entirely real, but utterly beyond the capacity of our senses to perceive. Some of the more commonplace examples might be radio waves or microwaves, and things quickly get weirder from there. Blind to many of these dimensions, our senses put us at the center of a world vastly larger and more complex than ourselves or our ability to comprehend. A point beautifully illustrated by the author Douglas Adams in his novel Mostly Harmless, part of the brilliant and hilarious Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. There's a wonderful scene in which a young woman takes a flat black disc of matter out of a box. The disc begins to morph into a small bird, and then a psychedelic light and sound show that would have made M.C. Escher jealous takes place. The bird changes colors, shapes, and sizes, sometimes disappearing completely. Sometimes the entire world around the woman becomes a tapestry of birds. She hears a voice in varying tones and frequencies asking her, "Can you see me now? Can you hear me now? How about now?" Eventually, the situation stabilizes and everything returns to normal, and we're left with a woman and a perfectly normal-looking bird having a conversation. The bird goes on to explain that it is, in fact, a pan-dimensional being, and for it to be able to interact with the woman, it had to tune in to the right dimensions, some in which we humans stand still, others in which we move in different directions, such as the straight line of time. The bird explains that the woman needs to understand that just because we perceive something, it doesn't mean that it is there. And just because we don't perceive something, it doesn't mean it isn't. It's a wonderful scene, and there are some profound points beneath it. At one juncture, the bird that is actually a pan-dimensional being explains quite concisely that all you really need to know for the moment is that the universe is a lot more complicated than you might think, even if you start from a position of thinking it's pretty damn complicated in the first place. And this is precisely to the point. We never see the whole picture, though inevitably we think again and again that we do. In fact, this self-confidence can be so abiding that when we discover something new, see something we hadn't noticed before, we quickly adjust our mental map of reality and decide, now I've got it. The problem is that we construct reality around our sense perceptions. We piece them together to make something solid enough that we can navigate it, and we lose track of the fact that it is just that, a construction. Our minds stitch together our disparate perceptions, sometimes bending and distorting them, sometimes adding in things that we didn't even perceive, and prevent us with a map of reality, one that we tend to misconstrue as accurate, or even as actual reality itself. But as any good cartographer will tell you, maps are not the places they represent. The really honest ones will even admit that ultimately, all maps lie. In the Heart Sutra, which we chanted a few moments ago, there are lines that speak about the senses. And you may have noticed that there aren't 5, there are 6. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no object of mind. The Buddhist understanding is that mind itself is a sense, and it doesn't live between our ears. Everything is mind. The tree outside the window is mind. The food on my dinner plate is mind. Even the cat's litter box is mind. And to me, you are mind, while to you, I am mind. Actually, it might be even better to add my in front of all of those minds. Everything I perceive is my mind, as everything you perceive is yours. And this has a profound implication. Whatever you perceive, whatever you see in the world, is actually your own reflection looking back at you. In the Precious Mirror Samadhi, a beautiful poem by the 9th century founder of what in Japan would become the Soto school, it says, facing a precious mirror, form and reflection behold each other. You aren't it, but in truth, it is you. The precious mirror here isn't some magical artifact. It is the very universe itself, the world around us all. So what are we to do with all of this delusion, these distorted maps? It's tempting to try to correct them, and this is how I've often engaged my practice, as an exercise in self-improvement. In fact, this is pretty much what brought me to Zen in the first place. That and the fact that I thought it was cool. As a teenager, I was pretty clear that I was a mess and needed sorting out, and Zen seemed like a good way to do it. I figured that with a little effort, I could have myself straightened out by the time I was 22, 25 at most, and then I could get on with my life. Needless to say, I've long since given up on that idea, and that's no longer how I practice, but I still think Zen is pretty cool. So, what to do with these distorted, delusive maps that aren't reality, don't align with it, and cause so many problems? What can we do if not struggle to correct them? I think the classic bumper sticker, "Don't believe everything you think," has it nearly right. I might say, don't believe anything you think. This points to not knowing, a profound and intimate truth of Zen. But how to embody it? I've found that the practice of meditation presents an intriguing and challenging invitation. The contemporary Zen teacher, Shohaku Okamura, says that Zen is not a method of correcting the distortion of our fabricated conceptual maps, but rather is the act of letting go of all maps and sitting down on the ground of reality. I like to think of it as letting go of my fixed ideas and letting reality come in. You see, we can't perceive reality because we are a part of it. There is no separation. But the good news is that reality includes us, and it includes our delusions. Later in the same essay, wonderfully entitled, "Those Who Greatly Realize Delusions Are Buddhas," Okamura goes on to say that to awaken to the reality of our delusion is itself Buddha. To realize delusion is to be a Buddha. So the good news is, you don't have to fix yourself. In fact, you probably can't. I certainly haven't been able to fix myself. I still blunder regularly because I've started to believe again in the distorted maps in my head. But I keep returning to this wonderful practice of simple presence, of letting go of my ideas about the world, and of just letting it all in. Thank you.